Okay, I think I'm live. Just give me 1 second to make sure everything's running properly. Okay. Yeah, alright. I think that's perfect. So, basically, the point of this stream is just to quickly look at the Quran and then see if what the Quran claims about Allah, and then seeing whether, for example, Jesus makes similar claims about himself, right? Because if he does, so like for example, right, just to give kind of a quick kind of explanation or backdrop here, if the Quran says something like only Allah, whatever, right, and then Jesus says the same about himself, well, the question is who is he claiming to be by that, right? Because often part of the kind of let's say the Islamic dawah is they'll say, well, Jesus doesn't call himself God. Now, I've addressed that question on so many different videos that he does. It's very clear. Even critical scholarship agrees with that. Some of whom, like some of the people who write that critical scholarship, are either atheist or agnostic, and they even unanimously agree. Like Bart Ehrman agrees that the four gospel writers, for example, view Jesus as God. Right? There's no circumventing that. Like it's a well established fact within academia that this is how they view Jesus. They view him as God, right? Especially when you look to something like the two powers in heaven theology, that kind of I would say it's the theology that you would find within Jewish apocalyptic literature, which even predates the time of Jesus. So, for example, like if we look at the Book of Enoch or Second Esdras or anything like that, this theology was well established. But anyway, putting that aside, we'll get into it. So what I'll do is I'll share my screen, and then we're going to do some quick comparisons between the two. And as I said as well, if anyone wants to come on, feel free to come on and we can have a discussion or whatever. Part of the reason why I'm doing this is just to show you guys, what the Bible actually says versus what the Quran says, and then explaining why, Islam for me is clearly not the truth. I have more than enough reason and more than enough evidence to come to that conclusion. So when Muslims say that Islam is logical and the truth, well, when I look at their religion and I analyze it, there's nothing about it that seems truthful, or in any way that seems like it comes from God, right? So just to give a bit of context in regards to myself, I'm already roughly on chapter. I've almost finished the second chapter, but I found nothing in the Quran that suggests that it's kalam Allah, as they put it, right? The speech of Allah. Everything that I've read in those two chapters has been utterly mediocre at best. And by the way, I know the common Muslim argument around that will say, well, you're not reading the Arabic, you're reading a translation. Well, if you want to say that, then you're going to have to justify how Abdul Salib, who was a former Arabic-speaking Muslim, how he even cites in an academic work that he did with Norman Geisler called it's called Answering Islam, how he says that the Arabic is actually very mediocre at best. It's like mediocre. It's mediocre Arabic at best, right? So, but the English translates very poorly. But then again, I mean, if your God is all-knowing and omniscient and all this kind of stuff, how can he not create a piece of literature that doesn't translate well, right? Because I understand Arabic is technically a Semitic language, but so is Hebrew. But there's parts of the Bible that just translate absolutely beautifully into English, and they read beautifully, and they're so deep, right? But there's nothing in the Quran. It's baseless. It has no depth to it. I have no reason to believe it's from Allah. Just by reading it alone, I get every sense that it's a man-made product. And then you couple that with the fact that the Quran has contradictions and errors. I went through some of the contradictions in a previous stream, sorry, not contradictions, but rather historical errors the Quran makes, like in chapter 10, verse 90 with the drowning of Pharaoh. No Egyptologist, no credible Egyptologist accepts that, right? That view that's given in the Quran in chapter 10, verse 90 is regarded by credible Egyptologists as an ahistorical claim. Likewise with the claim in chapter 20, verse 85 about the Samaritans at the time of Moses. Again, the consensus within academia is that that's a ahistorical claim, since the consensus for the Samaritan people is that they didn't emerge until the 8th century. Yet the Quran is stating that they were there at the time of Moses, which is ahistorical. So, like, you couple the fact the Quran reads like it was written by a man, right? And not a very good writer at that, couple that with the fact that you have historical errors, and then you have contradictions between the 7 so-called ahruf, right? So I'm just going to give one example. I went through a few the last time, but I'm going to share my screen and just show you one quickly that I found quite interesting. So, okay. Okay. So I have this muted. So I'm hoping you should be able to see this. So the point here in terms of what he's showing is he's showing a difference between the two, right? So the Al-Duri version of the Arabic, right? There's the Arabic there, right? Ajabto is the word. And it means, but I wonder, as in Allah wonders, okay? Okay, so the Al-Duri version, so this is the Arabic dialect or mode of recitation, whatever you want to call it, is saying, I wonder. Abjepto, right? I wonder. Allah wonders. Chapter 37, verse 12. But let's see what the Hafs version says. Okay, he's going to skip to the... Now, notice what the Hafs version says. The Hafs version says Abjepta, which is you, Muhammad, wonders. Right? So this is the same verse, right? Same surah, same ayahs. Two different modes of recitation here. The Hafs and the what's called the Al-Duri version. It's also in the Caliph version as well. But your argument that this is perfect preservation, yet you have modes that contradict each other in such a way that they change the meaning to the point that they don't align with each other. Because one is saying Muhammad wonders, the other is saying Allah wonders. Which is it? Is it Ajepta, Muhammad wonders, or is it Abjepto, Allah wonders? Like, what's the answer here? That's a contradiction. You can't sit there and say they're the same thing when one is saying Muhammad wonders and then the other is saying Allah wonders. Which is it? Who's wondering here? And if Allah is wondering, that's even worse. Why does Allah need to wonder if he knows all things? Right? So, again, this is just one example. In my previous stream, I went through several others, right? And I would love for someone to come on and justify this and explain it, because this clearly shows that your text is not perfectly preserved, since your qira'at do not line up with each other at all. They contradict each other in places where we can clearly see that the meaning is being changed to the point that they're not, as I said, they're not in agreement. Right? If you're talking perfect preservation, then they should be in perfect agreement across all the 7 qira'at, but they're not. So again, it's just something to think about. Like, okay. So now what we'll do is we're going to look at. I just need to make sure this is actually changing properly. Okay, this seems to be stuck on this one screen. We're going to now go to the verses in the Quran that I want to look at, and I'm going to demonstrate why this why this shows that Muhammad is just ripping from the Bible without really understanding what he's ripping from. But you're going to see it straight away. So if we go to, okay, I'm just going to share. I'll share my entire screen, and then this should work. So, this is chapter 22, verse 6 of the Quran, right? According to chapter 22, verse 6 of the Quran, it says that Allah alone, right? Alone, meaning he's the only one, is the truth, right? He gives life to the dead, and he alone is most capable of everything. Now, I think verse 7 also says he's the one who resurrects. Yeah, and Allah will surely resurrect those in their graves. Okay, so, but let's focus in on chapter 22, verse 6 for a second. What is it telling us? It's telling us that Allah alone is the truth. And in other words, only he's the truth. So you like, and I think some people might know where I'm going with this, right? Because Jesus actually calls himself Al-Haq in John 14:6, right? Now, if you want to sit there and say, well, a prophet can call himself the truth. No, he can't. According to your Quran, only Allah is the truth. Yes, a prophet will mediate the truth, which is God's revelation to the people. But the prophet himself is not the truth. The truth is not innate of the prophet, since the prophet is not the source of the truth. God is. Therefore, God is the truth. And that's why in chapter 22, verse 6, it says, Allah alone is the truth. He alone is Al-Haq. Unless you want to show me a passage in your Quran where one of your prophets, one of your pseudo-prophets, refers to themselves as Al-Haq. You can't find it. It doesn't exist. However, in John 14:6, Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, there's al-haq, and the life, right? So if Jesus is claiming to be al-haq, and according to the Quran, only Allah is al-haq, who's he claiming to be? I think the answer is quite obvious, right? He's claiming to be God, because by the standard of your own Quran, only Allah is al-haq. According to the Arabic, only Allah is the truth. A prophet, as I said, a prophet is not the truth. Yes, they mediate the truth, but they're not the source of the truth. Therefore, they cannot be called the truth. The source of the truth is God. Therefore, he is the truth, and he's the only one that can be called the truth, right? So if Jesus is calling himself the truth, and the Quran says only Allah is the truth, who's he claiming to be? He's claiming to be God. It's very, very obvious. And then when it talks about, and Allah will be the one who will resurrect those in their graves. I wonder, did Jesus ever refer to himself in a similar way? Well, if we go to John 11:25, let's listen to what Jesus calls himself, right? Jesus says here, he calls himself the resurrection and the life, right? Now, this paradigm of Jesus being the resurrection and the life is littered throughout this gospel, right? It's littered throughout the gospels, not just this one, but the other ones as well, that Jesus will be the one to resurrect those from their graves. But wait a minute. According to your Quran, chapter 22, verses 6 and 7, what does it tell us? Allah alone is the truth. Okay, Jesus called himself the truth. Allah alone is the one who gives life to the dead. He alone is the one who will surely resurrect those in their graves. But wait a minute. Jesus said all that stuff about himself. He calls himself the life, right? Just actually hear what's going on here, right? Again, it says Allah alone is the one who gives life to the dead, right? Meaning only he can do that. But Jesus is claiming that he's the one who does that. And not only that, that he's the one who will resurrect those in their graves. So who's he claiming to be? Well, again, by the standard of your own Quran, he's claiming to be God. I hope that makes sense. So I think you can see where I'm going with this, right? So that's just one example, right? And I think if you're sincere in your reading this, or you're listening to this rather, whilst reading these passages, you can clearly see the correlation here. What Muhammad has done is he's obviously taken this passage from John, right? And he's altered it, he's redacted it, he's changed it, right? Because in John we know that Jesus is the truth, right? Jesus refers to himself as al-haq. But according to the Quran, only Allah is al-haq. So if only God can be al-haq, and Jesus calls himself the truth, then who's he claiming to be? He's claiming to be God, right? And on top of that, we know, as I said, Jesus calls himself in John 11:25 the resurrection and the life. But wait a minute, isn't Allah, according to your Quran, the resurrection, in the sense that he's the one who will resurrect on the day of judgment? But Jesus says on the day of judgment, he's the one who's going to resurrect. So who's he claiming to be, right? So that's one example. Now here's another example, right? This one is particularly disturbing, I would say, for a Muslim. This is chapter 2, verse 210 of the Quran. Look at what your Quran says, right? It says that on the day of judgment, that your Allah, he's going to come on the clouds of heaven with his angels for judgment, for the judgment of the world. That sounds very familiar to a number of passages that we have in the Bible, right? So, for example, Matthew 24, 25, 26. And then on top of that, we have, we have it in Mark chapter, 14 as well. It's throughout all the Gospels, this particular claim. But the question is when this claim comes up in the Gospels, who's making this claim, right? So let's break it down just before I do that, right? So again, what's it telling us here? It's telling us that on the day of judgment, Allah is going to come on the clouds of heaven with his angels to judge the entire world. So if you're a Muslim, you would agree with me that on the day of judgment, only Allah is the one who's going to come on the clouds of heaven with the angels for the purpose of the universal judgment of the entire world, as the cosmic judge, as the final cosmic judge, right? So you would agree with me with that, right? Okay, well, let's go to Matthew 24 and see what Jesus says. So this is what Jesus says, speaking of himself. Jesus is the Son of Man. He uses this phrase self-referentially throughout the entirety of these Gospels. But what does he tell us, right? He says, then will appear in heaven the sign of the Son of Man, And then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he will send out his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. Right? And you find the same in Matthew 25. So in Matthew 25, it's referred to as the final judgment of the Son of Man. And then Jesus in this is inaugurated as the final judge, the king, who enacts his judgment within this eschatological parable. But wait a minute. Doesn't your Quran say that on the day of judgment, Allah is the one who's coming on the clouds of heaven with his angels to judge the entire world? But then if only Allah does that, and Jesus is saying in a number of passages, for example, 24, 25, 26, it's also in 16, it's also in Mark 14, so on and so forth. If Jesus is saying that on the day of judgment, he's coming on the clouds of heaven with his angels to judge the entire world, and this is something that according to your own Quran, only Allah does, who's he claiming to be? He's claiming to be God, right? Again, it's by the standard of your own text. So, I mean, like, what are you going to do with that, right? Because this is what your own text says. Your own text says that Allah on the day of judgment, he's the one who's going to come on the clouds of heaven with his angels to judge the entire world as the final cosmic judge. But Jesus says that that's him. He's going to be the one doing that. So it's very, very clear who he's claiming to be. And those are in his own words. So there's another example. And just one, and by the way, I could pick out hundreds and hundreds of examples for this. Like, I mean, it's so clear. But anyway, we'll put that one aside. So then in chapter 57, verse 3 of the Quran, your God, Allah, gives himself a title. He calls himself the first and the last, right? The first and the last, meaning he's the only God, right? That there's no other God besides him, that he's the only God, right? He's the first and the last, that he's without days, right? That he has eternally existed, right? This is what your Quran says of Allah. But if we go to Revelation chapter 1, and we drop down to verse 17, this is speaking of Jesus, by the way. This is Jesus speaking. Listen to what Jesus says. Fear not, I am the first and the last. Right? So, if your Quran is saying that Allah is the first and the last, and Jesus calls himself the first and the last, who's he claiming to be? He's claiming to be God, no? So when you ask the question, well, where does Jesus claim to be God? Well, according to your own Quran and by the standard of your own Quran, it's littered throughout in a number of places. Why? Because according to your Quran, only Allah is Al-Haq. But Jesus calls himself Al-Haq in John 14:6. According to your Quran, on the day of judgment, chapter 2, verse 210, Allah is the one who's going to come on the clouds of heaven with his angels to judge the entire world. But Jesus says that on the day of judgment, he's the one doing that. He's the one who's going to come on the clouds of heaven alongside the angels, with his angels, and he's going to judge the entire world, right? It's in Matthew 24, 25, 26, Mark 14, so on and so forth. So you get the point, right? So this is a consistent testimony of the synoptics, the synoptic authors, as well as John, right? That this is who Jesus is. He's the cosmic judge. He's the final cosmic judge. He is God incarnate. And because he's God incarnate, he'll also be the one who's going to return for judgment. It's as simple as that. And that's why Jesus can say that about himself. And that's why he does say that about himself in a number of places. There's no workaround for that, unless you want to say your Quran is wrong. So when your Quran says in chapter 22, verse 6, that Allah alone is the truth, is that right? Well, if you believe your Quran, you better believe it. And if you believe it, well, when Jesus calls himself Al-Haq in John 14:6, who's he claiming to be according to your Quran? He's claiming to be God. Likewise with chapter 2, verse 210, same thing. And likewise with chapter 57, verse 3, same thing. Right? These are claims that are attributed only to Allah, yet Jesus claims them for himself. Who's he claiming to be? I hope that makes sense. So one other thing I just want to quickly point out. This is just kind of a quick side one, right? So this is in chapter 8 of Matthew. So this is Matthew chapter 8. Now, when people ask, right? In regards to Jesus and like people's perception of Jesus, did they perceive him as just a man or just this, just that? Well, interestingly, again, now what's funny is that in Matthew chapter 14, Jesus is worshipped by his followers. Okay? According to your own Quran, who do you worship? right? Why are Jesus' own disciples in Matthew chapter 14 dropping to their feet and worshiping him? Well, because they believe he's God. They do the same in Matthew 28. After his resurrection, they drop to their feet and they worship him, right? So it's the same thing that's going on there, right? But according to your own Quran, you'd only worship Allah, right? Yet Jesus' own followers, according to the Bible, actually got down and worshipped him, right? So anyway, that's just a side note. But in terms of Matthew chapter 8, I want us to read these couple of verses and really listen to what's going on here, right? So effectively, what happens here is this is called Jesus calming the storm, right? So Jesus is in a boat with his disciples. There's a huge storm that takes place as they're out in sea, right? So obviously they get very scared. They get frightened that the ship could be destroyed and they could be just destroyed alongside the ship, right? But what does Jesus do, right? He calms the storm. He rebukes it by his own authority, by his own word. He rebukes it. And not only that, the elements obey him. They obey him, right? And look at the reaction of the people with him, right? What sort of man is this that even the winds and sea obey him? That doesn't sound like followers who are sitting there like, this guy's just a man, he's just a prophet. No, they're actually questioning if he's even a man, right? So much so that by the time we get to chapter 14, they're bowing down, worshiping him. So much so that by 28, after his resurrection, same thing, they're bowing down and worshiping him. But in this particular context, they're asking themselves if he's even a man. They can't even fathom what's going on. And the question would be, why is that? Well, according to Psalm 107, you're going to see something very interesting here, right? I'm going to see now if I can quickly find it. But in Psalm, I think it's this Psalm, if I'm not mistaken. It could be a different one, but I'm almost sure it's this one. Yeah, listen to this. According to Psalm 107, who's the one who's calming the storms and the seas? Well, it's Yahweh, right? God is the one who calms the storms and the seas. That's his power. That's his prerogative. The elements obey him. But in Matthew chapter 8, Jesus does something that according to the Old Testament, only God can do, which is he commands and he rebukes the elements, right? And as I just established from Psalm 107, that's only something Yahweh can do. That's only something God can do. And it's for that reason that they then question if he's even a man. They can't even fathom what they've just seen because they've seen something that according to their own understanding, only Yahweh is supposed to do. Okay? And then in Psalm, we don't have, we're not going to get too much into this now, but just something I want to point out is that according to Psalm 146, right, God is the one who opens the eyes of the blind. Well, interestingly enough, Jesus is portrayed in a number of places as opening the eyes of the blind. And when he does that, he's acknowledged as Lord, as God, right? Whenever he does that, they acknowledge him as God. And the other thing is that when they acknowledge him as God, he doesn't rebuke them. So, for example, if Jesus was only a prophet, if his disciples were bowing down and worshiping him, as we find in Matthew 14 and Matthew 28, why doesn't he rebuke them? Why is he accepting worship? Because we have another instance where in Revelation 22, for example, an angel is being worshipped and he rebukes John immediately and tells him not to worship me, worship only God, right? But when Jesus is worshipped, he accepts it. Now, if he accepts worship, why would he be doing that unless he is God and he knows he's God? Think about it. So, yeah, sorry, Psalm 146, it says that only Yahweh opens the eyes of the blind. We know from, for example, John chapter 9, Jesus does the same thing. You also have it in the synoptics as well, right? But Jesus is being portrayed in a number of passages as Yahweh incarnate because he's doing things that according to the Old Testament only Yahweh can do. So we saw with Psalm 107, right? Yahweh is the one who silences the storms, right? He's the one who rebukes the elements. Well, Matthew chapter 8 portrays Jesus as doing that. And then obviously John chapter 9 and in the other synoptic, same kind of, let's say, chapter/verses where they portray or they give us a similar narrative of Jesus opening the eyes of the blind. Well, according to Psalm 146, that's something only God does. So you can see clearly who they're portraying him to be, right? So again, it's just, guys, it's worth considering. It's like, if this is the consistent testimony of the Gospels, right? And not only that, your own Quran is telling us these things, and you can correlate the two with one another. You can see the connection immediately. And what's funny is that even according to your own Quran, yeah, Jesus is the one opening the eyes of the blind, right? It's in chapter 3 of the Quran. And then Muhammad in chapter 80 of the Quran, verses 1 to 10, is abusing the blind. Yet you believe that Muhammad is a better example than Jesus, even though according to your own Quran, Muhammad abuses blind people, whereas Jesus heals them. This is according to your own Quran. As I said, chapter 3, Jesus is portrayed as the one who heals the blind in the Quran. Chapter 80 of the Quran, verses 1 to 10, Muhammad makes fun of a blind person. So much so that he has to repent for it. And yet this is the guy you follow, among other stuff that he did. Right? So even by the standard of your own Quran, Jesus is a better example, an infinitely better example. But yeah, as I said, like, really, really look into this stuff, check it, and then see the connections for yourself. There's no point sitting there and telling people, nowhere does Jesus call himself God. Like, as I just established, there's a number of places where, by the standard of your own Quran, it's very clear that he's claiming to be God, right? Because your Quran says, chapter 22, verse 6, only Allah is the truth. Well, Jesus claimed to be the truth. He claimed to be Allah in John 14:6. And a prophet can't claim that, because a prophet is not the truth. As I said, a prophet mediates the truth, but the truth is not innate of the prophet. The source of that truth is God. Therefore, claiming to be that, you would have to be, as I said, that truth with the so-called revelatory objective truth would have to be innate of you, and it's not of a prophet. They merely mediate God's truth to the people, but they are not that truth themselves. That's why God alone, according to the Quran, is the truth. And then Jesus, as I said, calls himself Al-Haq in John 14:6. And then obviously Quran 57 verse 3, who's Allah? He's the first and the last. Jesus says in Revelation 1:17, he's the first and the last. Chapter 2 verse 210 of the Quran, Allah is the one on the day of judgment who's going to come with the clouds of heaven with his angels to judge the entire world. Well, Jesus says in Matthew 16, 24, 25, 26, Mark 14, so on and so forth, that he's the one who's going to come on the day of judgment with his angels to judge the entire world. So who's he claiming to be? It's by the standard of your own Quran, he's claiming to be Allah. And it's clear that what Muhammad did was he took those verses, right, as part of his whole kind of agenda, which was to make himself fit into the narrative, because the Old Testament and the New Testament make it very clear that all things have been fulfilled in Christ. Therefore, there's no place for Muhammad in the revelation of the Old and New Testament, right? So what does Muhammad have to do? Well, if he's trying to make up and invent his own religion, well, he has to find a way to make himself fit. So he has to redact things, change them, and then find a way to fit himself into the structure. And the only way you can do that is if the structure doesn't support you, is you have to restructure that original structure, which is what he did, right? So it's like, well, all things were fulfilled in Jesus. Jesus is God in the flesh. He fulfilled all things. Muhammad's line of thinking is what? Well, you know what? I'll take his divinity away, make him just a prophet, so I can then make myself a continuation of everything that came before. That's literally what it is. It's very, very clear, guys. You have to test these things. You have to check them. Okay. And again, I'm not, like, at the end of the day, I'm not saying this to, I'm not saying this to, oh, let me just make sure that this is, stop screen. Okay, perfect. Sorry, I'm not saying this to bash you guys, right? I know it might seem like that. I'm just showing you that by the standard of your own Quran, Jesus did claim to be God very clearly, right? And secondly, like, we're talking about the truth here. We're talking about your salvation, right? So if your salvation hinges upon the truth, I have to be open with you and I have to be honest with you. So don't be offended by it. I understand, these are sensitive issues and sensitive matters, but at the end of the day, guys, if it comes to the truth and it comes to your own salvation, you have to be able to put your emotions aside for a moment and actually decide what's best. And if what's best is to accept the truth, to accept God's truth, as opposed to following a lie that a man who came 500-600 years later after Jesus invented, it's like, guys, come on, this is your salvation. Like, really, really consider these things. Like, even if we focus in on the Jesus of the Quran, as I said, again, that's a pseudo Jesus. But by your own theology, Jesus was sinless and never did anything wrong. But then by the standard of your own hadith, well, let's see what Muhammad did. Well, what did Muhammad do? He beat Aisha according to your own hadith. Abu Bakr punches Aisha according to your own hadith. According to your own hadith, there's a woman who's beaten so severely, comes to Muhammad with green marks on her body, and Muhammad just sits there like a cartoon character and goes, well, what are you going to do about it? Like, this is the guy you're following. And that's not even factoring into the equation his relationship with Aisha, who he married at 6. Right? And I know that most of you guys aren't comfortable with that. But according to your own traditions, you should be. In other words, if you had a 6-year-old and a Muslim man came up and said, I want to marry them, well, you should be totally okay with that, because that's what your prophet did. You know, there shouldn't be a double standard here. So there's that. There's other stuff as well. Like, I didn't even get into him doing piracy in Medina. When he was in Medina, he was looting caravan sites, right? On top of that, we didn't even get into the number of assassinations your prophet had carried out on different poets, like Jewish poets, who basically just wrote a satirical poem about him, right? Just think about that for a moment. Your own prophet had such a frail ego that when someone insulted him, his immediate response was have them executed. Jesus in Matthew, if I think it's Matthew chapter 12, says, anyone who insults my name will be forgiven. But according to your prophet, it's like, anyone who insults my name, I'm going to execute them. And this is the guy you follow. You know, like, guys, really think about this, because it's what it is. And I'm not trying to say this to hurt you guys. I'm just saying this to point out the truth. It's that what you hear in the mosque is a cherry-picked version of the hadith that they use to kind of support a view that Muhammad was a semi-decent figure, right? Even though you guys uphold him to this like sinless ultimate example. But if you look at your hadith, and by the way, all the hadith that I was quoting there, which is in the hadith, are Sahih grade. They're not Hassan. They're not anything else. These are strong hadith according to your own traditions. And as I said, according to your own traditions, Sahih hadith, which is acceptable hadith, good hadith, reliable hadith. Your Muhammad of history was a guy who engaged in piracy. You know, he had people executed. He killed people, right? Again, he condoned rape of slaves, even if they were married, according to chapter 4 of the Quran, right? He had black slaves, right? He said women were inferior, by the way, and because they're inferior, more of them will be in hell. He beat Aisha. Aisha was punched by Abu Bakr and nothing happened. The woman with the green marks, who was so severely beaten, he did nothing about it. He just sat there like a cartoon character. Like, guys, really, really sit there and think about it, because if, according to your own tradition and your own understanding within your own theology, that he's the ultimate example, his example should speak for itself. Like, the ironic thing here is that Jesus' example does speak for itself, because even outside of Christianity, there's a consensus that Jesus was a good example. For example, both Sam Harris and Dawkins both agree that Jesus is, relatively speaking, on the balance of things, a good moral and ethical example. They do not share that sentiment about Muhammad. Look at what Sam Harris has said about Muhammad, and look at what Dawkins has said about Muhammad. They both agree that Muhammad was one of the most repulsive, evil, wicked historical figures to ever live. Why are they saying that? Right? Because they have looked at your data. They have looked at the different seerahs that were written on Muhammad. They have looked at that, and they've come to that conclusion based on everything that they've seen and heard about him. They don't share that sentiment about Jesus. With Jesus, they at least agree that he was a good person, a good moral and ethical person. They don't agree about that when it comes to Muhammad. Okay? So my point here is, and listen to what I'm saying, if he is by your own theology the ultimate example, then his example should speak for itself. But interestingly enough, if you're not indoctrinated into Islam and you just look at it from the outside, you're repulsed by him. He's a very repulsive figure, unless you're okay with all the things that I just mentioned. And I know for a fact the people that heard those things are not okay with them. And if you're not okay with them, why are you sitting there continuing to follow him and uphold him and defend him when you know there's things that he did that you don't agree with, that you would never do? If you would never, because remember, according to your Quran, he's the ultimate example for all generations, right? So if he did those things, you better be sitting there agreeing with everything that he did, not disagreeing with it. So when he punched, when he hit Aisha, when Abu Bakr punched Aisha, the woman with the green marks, right? Him having people executed, right? Him having slaves. Like, guys, you should be agreeing with all of that, right? If you don't agree with it and your spirit is telling you that that's not, like, in your heart of hearts, if it's telling you that that's not something you agree with, then, like, you have to make a decision. So yeah, I'm gonna leave it there for the moment. I just wanted to do a bit of a short stream. I'll wait around for a few minutes if someone wants to join and have a quick conversation about some of the stuff. Oh yeah, I didn't even. I think I did actually. I mentioned at the start the contradiction. The historical errors the Quran makes. So when someone asks me, why I don't agree with Islam and why am I not, Muslim? Well, that's my answer. One, your book reads like it was written by a man very clearly. As I said, I'm 2 chapters in, and it's been this baseless, shallowless text. So I have no reason to believe that that text itself is from God. But even if I was to grant it that, even in spite of the mediocrity of every word on every page of this book that I've read so far, which you call God's, Kalam Allah, even if I was to grant it that, it's like you have historical errors in the Quran, right, as found in chapter 10, verse 90 and chapter 20, verse 85. And then on top of that, you have contradictions between your 7 akruf, right? The 7 kirat, they have contradictions between them. So, like, all the evidence points towards the fact that the case for Islam is non-existent. There's zero case for it. It's so weak, and it's so poor on an evidence-based kind of study that there's no reason to ever accept it, right? And ironically, the way you guys react then when someone doesn't accept it, then is you resort to insults, right? You laugh at them, you resort to insults, right? Again, this is what Islam teaches, by the way. This is I understand that according to your own traditions, anyone who doesn't accept Islam, you guys regard as losers. That's a term that is used within your own literature of people who reject Islam. You call them losers, right? And you'll insult them. And I mean, that's the pathology of a Muslim. If you truly are a Muslim, it's not a nice pathology at all. It's like, well, what do you guys do then when someone absolutely rejects your religion according to laws of apostasy? Well, you have them killed and executed, right? And then look at the rights of women and all that kind of stuff, right? As I said, Muhammad's view of women was that they were inferior. Okay, he says they're inferior in intellect according to your own hadith, right? These are his own words. Do you agree with that? Is that okay? Anyway, I'm going to wait another 2 minutes if someone wants to come on and discuss. And if not, we'll just kind of wrap it up there, basically. But yeah, feel free as well. Feel free to comment or whatever if you have any suggestions. Or if you want to come on at some other time, we can try and arrange something. So just drop a message in the comment section. I'll get back to you and maybe we can arrange a discussion. Because I'm always, as I said, I'm always willing to have people on to have a discussion over these things just to see, how you react to these things. Because as I said, I'm giving you my honest reaction. I'm trying to be honest with you. I'm not doing this to be disrespectful. I'm just giving you my honest reaction to how I feel about it. As I said, this is how I honestly feel. I have no reason to believe the Quran is from God because it reads like the most mediocre piece of literature, one of the most shallow pieces of literature I've ever read. Right, and yet you want me to believe it's Kalam Allah when it's so shallow and so baseless and such a weak piece of literature. I can't. I'm sorry. It loses that argument instantly when you get to page 3 of it because again you're reading something that you're in your head you're this is clearly written by a person. I have read so many books, so many different forms of literature, and I'll just give you an example of what I'm trying to say here to better express it. Right, the first chapter of Dante's Divine Comedy, which is way shorter, by the way, than the first 2 chapters of the Quran. That first chapter of Dante's Divine Comedy is infinitely deeper, infinitely richer, and infinitely more revelatory than anything in those 2 chapters combined of the Quran. Yet you want me to believe it's Kalam Allah. Unless your Allah is a very weak, poor writer. I don't know. Is he? I don't think you would agree to that. Obviously, if you believe he's all knowing and whatever, and he's the author of literature, his literature should stand out from every other piece of literature, but it doesn't. It actually it barely meets the mark of average. But anyway, putting that aside, then there's obviously, as I said, the historical errors in the Quran, right, about Pharaoh drowning in chapter 10, verse 90, which no credible Egyptologist accepts. Chapter 20, verse 85, saying, talking about the Samaritan woman at the time Moses. Again, the consensus within archaeology, history, so on and so forth, right, is that, again, that's an ahistorical claim. So you have that. And then on top of that, as I said, you have the fact that the 7, your 7 Akhruf qirats, they contradict each other in a number of places where the meaning, it's not just a recitation difference, it's a meaning difference where it changes the meaning of the sentence. And then you couple that with the fact that the prophet that you claim is the ultimate example for mankind, according to your own hadith, is a very repulsive, wicked individual, and yet you want people to sit there and follow him and accept everything he did when he did things that were utterly vile. I mean, it doesn't make any sense, guys. So, like, again, I'm not saying this to bash you guys. I'm not saying this to hurt you guys. I'm saying this because I want you to actually really consider these things and put the indoctrination aside and actually just consider these things, right? It speaks volumes when the consensus outside of Christianity is that Jesus was a good, moral, and ethical individual. So much so, by the way, and then again, this is something else to consider. When people leave Christianity, they don't leave because of the example of Jesus. Yet when people leave Islam, it's consistently. You can see the testimonies for yourself. When people say they're an ex-Muslim, look them up. It's consistently because of the example of Muhammad. What does that tell you about Muhammad if people are leaving because of his moral and ethical example? It's not that he's being misunderstood. It's that when people look at the things that he did, as I said, engaging in piracy, which is stealing in Medina, which he did, having poets executed who insulted him. Like when people insult him, his response was have them executed. Saying women were inferior, having women beaten, condoning men beating their wives, all this kind of stuff, right? Him hitting Aisha, right? Obviously the thing with children, obviously the rape of slaves, owning black slaves, all this kind of stuff. You can't sit there and justify it, guys, right? And if you're gonna sit there and justify it, like, you seriously need help, because that's not good. Like, that's not good morality at all. But as I said, at least with Jesus, the consistent testimony, even outside of Christianity, is that he was a good, moral, and ethical example. And we find that with Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins. They both agree with that, right? And I know you can sit there and you can say, well, they're atheists, so I couldn't care less what they say. Well, guess what? According to your own Quran and your own traditions and your own hadith, don't they have a fitra? Doesn't every single person have a fitra? So even if Sam Harris is an atheist, and even if Dawkins is an atheist, well, they still possess a fitra that God has given them. And they both determine with that fitra that Muhammad was a vile, repulsive, historical figure. And their same fitra tells them that Jesus was a good example. So why is that? Again, that's a question for you guys to think about. And it's not based on misunderstanding, guys. This is a consistent testimony outside of Islam. This is the consistent view that people have, you know? So I'll just give it one more minute. And we'll see if anyone wants to chat briefly. But if not, we can pretty much wrap it up there. Okay, I'll just wait one more minute just to give someone a chance if they want to come on and have a discussion. Obviously, I've pinned the link, the StreamYard link, so you can use that to join, and we can have a quick discussion over it if you want to try and explain some stuff. As I said, feel free. You're more than welcome to come on and have a discussion, whether you're Muslim or Christian or whatever, and trying to help me to understand these things. Because as I said, when I look at them, I'm just like, the evidence is very clear to me in terms of what direction it points. Islam for me is a very, very, the case for Islam is so bad. It's just so bad. Unless you want to come on and prove it, right? If you want to come on and prove it, I'd be more than willing to listen, guys. But and as I said, look, it doesn't matter if you're Muslim, Christian, whatever, you can come on. The link is there, the StreamYard link, and we can have a quick discussion over this stuff. Because I'm willing to listen to what you guys have to say, but just be sincere with the data. Just be honest with it. Like, if the data is saying one thing, and you just want to appeal to emotion constantly because of your feelings or whatever, because of how you feel about it, you're never going to get to the truth, guys. You have to be able to put that stuff aside and just look at these things objectively. I'll just wait another minute, and then if no one wants to come on and have a discussion, we'll wrap it up there. But as I said, feel free to come on. The link is there. we can go through whatever. I'm more than willing to spend time with anyone who wants to come on and have a quick discussion over these things. Because, as I said, they're very important. Like, we're talking about your salvation here, right? And if you care enough about me, you'd want to preach, you'd want to do your dawah, because according to your own Quran, that's what you're expected to do, right? You're expected to give dawah, unless you're not a Muslim, right? Unless you don't want to follow your Quran, right? So, yeah. Let me just quickly check. Okay, I'll give it 30 more seconds. I always find this funny as well. It's like you go through the contradictions, you go through the clear historical errors the Quran makes, and yet you guys never want to come on and defend it. It's like you guys know that, it's like you guys know that it can't be defended, but yet you just want to sit there accepting it, follow the lie. But at the end of the day, guys, it's your salvation. I really, really do care. I really do wish you guys could just objectively sit back and actually critique your own religion. Because you're very good at critiquing other people's positions, but you don't want to critique your own. Like, as I said, just put the indoctrination aside. We're talking about your salvation here, right? This is your salvation we're talking about. But yet you're content with just following, a religion that, as I said, I've demonstrated so many times. There's so many holes in this religion, yet you want to continue following it, right? Unless for you guys, the standard of God is that he creates a book that has a number of errors in it, historical contradictions, whatever you want to call them. And then, like, you have other stuff, like with the example of Muhammad, and then it's like, I have no reason to believe it, guys. I have no reason to believe it unless you want to come on and try and explain it. But as I said, like, anyone, feel free to come on, Muslim, Christian, whoever, and we can have a brief discussion over these things, because I'm willing to spend the time with anyone who wants to have an honest discussion over this. And it won't be like those, don't worry, it's not like those Muslim Dawah channels where they're just going to sit there and insult you because that's the example of Muhammad that they're following, because that's what Muhammad did. That's not going to happen here. Okay. So as I said, like, you guys as well, if you want, you can also, if you want a future discussion, you can also drop a comment, and I'll try and set that up, especially for the Muslims. If you want to, like, have a good conversation over these things, you're more than welcome to come on the channel, and I'll set up a stream or whatever, and we can, you can go through stuff with me and try and explain it or whatever. But as I said, just be open. Be open at the end of the day. Like, always presuppose it's possible that the thing that you're following is not true. Because when I analyzed the Bible for the first time and I critiqued it, that's what it was. It was a critique. I was critical of it. But what led me to believe it was the fact that I could not disprove, especially when I focused in on the life of Jesus, the evidence for his life as far as him being God, right, incarnate, as well as the crucifixion, as well as the resurrection. The proof for that was so positive and so strong that I could not help but accept it. It's not like the Quran where you have again, this goes back to the whole evidence thing. Like, this is why Islam is not an evidence-based religion. It's a blind faith religion. Surah Al-Nisa, verse 157 says Jesus wasn't crucified. Okay? That's the interpretation that Sunni Muslims today go with. They go with this idea of substitution. There's no evidence for it. That's the problem. There's zero evidence for it. The consistent testimony of the 1st and 2nd century that we have is that he was absolutely crucified. We have a source by Josephus, Flavius Josephus, called the Flavius Testimonium, where he talks about the crucifixion of Jesus. Okay? And by the way, like, I understand very well that source is partially interpolated, but the majority view within scholarship, and you can check this because Bart Ehrman did a video on this, is that the majority view is that when it talks about Jesus being crucified under Pilate, that part of it is genuine to Josephus. Same applies to Tacitus as well, right? So we have these sources which clearly tell us that he was absolutely crucified, yet your Quran says he wasn't crucified, and there's no evidence for it. The only evidence to support the Quran view is found in the Gnostics. But the Gnostics believed Jesus was divine. They weren't Muslims. So my challenge always to a Muslim, and they can't do it. They can't do it. They don't, because they have nothing, right? I spoke with a Muslim on a channel before. I think his name was Wassam. I asked him a very clear question. I said, give me one Muslim source from the 1st or 2nd century that affirms Surah Al-Nisa verse 157. And he went to the Gospel of Judas. Gospel of Judas was not written by a Muslim. It was written by a Gnostic who believed Jesus was the closest emanation that came forth from God, meaning he was in some sense the image of God. Like the actual image, as far as, I'm not talking about being an image bearer in the sense of us, but in terms of a like nature, a like divine nature, right? Because he was the highest created thing. Now, the thing is that, and again, even within that, they believed in other stuff, like this idea of a demiurge and all that kind of stuff. So the author of the Gospel of Judas was absolutely, categorically not a Muslim, because he commits shirk in about 15 different places in his own gospel. So again, this is what I'm saying. You don't have a source for it. And just like with chapter 61, verse 6 of the Quran, where it says what? It says that Jesus prophesied that this is what he prophesied to his own disciples. In his own words, he said, Ahmed will be coming after me. Well, guess what? We don't have a single document, not one document before the time of Muhammad where Ahmed is on it. Zero evidence. Yet you guys just want to follow it because the Quran says so. Well, how about genuinely test these things, guys? Actually test them and see if they're true or not. As opposed to blindly following something. Because if you're going to blindly follow something, guys, again, I don't want this for you. That's the thing. I do not want this for you. I absolutely want for you guys to come to the truth, and I'm willing to spend all the time in the world to help you to get there. Which, by the way, is contrary to the Muslim example. Because I saw a video that Rob did with Dawah Digest. And in that video, he actually admitted to Rob that the level of self-service that Rob is talking about when he talks about like going the distance for someone, he says, as Muslims, we're not called to do that. Imagine that. And again, I know what he's getting at. Like, that's because that's what Muhammad is. Muhammad does not exemplify self-sacrifice because he never gave up his life for another, even though that's the highest manifestation of love. But that's besides the point. Muhammad does not exemplify humility. Why? Well, because by the end of his life, he was the tyrannical ruler of the South Arabian Peninsula, right? But when it comes to self-sacrifice and humility and willing to go the distance for another, willing to humble yourself, to spend, all the time in the world to help someone, again, that theology does not exist within Islam because it's not found in the example of Muhammad. Muhammad never gave up his life for another. He never humbled himself. Right? There's no example of it in the Hadith. It's all in the opposite end. It's all in the opposite end. So, yeah. Okay. We'll wrap it up there, guys. Thank you so much. As I said, you're Muslims, Christians, you're always welcome to come on, especially these streams, which are particularly for the Muslims, to come on, have a discussion, and to help me understand these things. As I said, this is not going to be like the Dawah channels where they're following Muhammad and they're insulting people left, right, and center. That's not going to happen because I really do care about you. Jesus tells us to love everyone, right, effectively, right? Whether you're my closest enemy or my worst enemy or my closest friend, I have to view you in terms of love, in terms of my willingness to go the distance for you and serve you, in spite of if we're at totally separate ends of one another, at totally opposite sides. I still have to show you the same love and respect that I would show someone else. Again, that example doesn't exist in Islam, right? And maybe we can spend a stream going through that, where Muhammad talks about how to deal with apostates, how to deal with the idolaters, the polytheists, so on and so forth, right? Where he condones killing them, he condones mistreating them, he condones abusing them. Again, you don't have that with Jesus. It's completely the opposite. It's like Jesus teaches one thing and then Muhammad does a 180 on it. Like when Jesus said, for example, if you live by the sword, you'll die by the sword. Muhammad's philosophy was, unless you live by the sword, you'll die by the sword. In other words, he promotes the usage of violence. So stuff like that. But as I say, guys, you're always welcome to come on, and if you want to arrange stream at a later point and come on or whatever, just drop a comment, and yeah, we'll get you on at some time. So yeah, all the best, and take care, and God bless.